I never thought a job could feel like this, like stepping into a space that hums just below the surface, alive with possibility and tension I don't know how to name. When she hired me as a carpenter, I expected the usual: measuring, sanding, fitting, practical work, dust in my hair, sweat on my shirt. What I didn't expect was the way she watched me, or how a glance could make my stomach tighten like I'd swallowed too much coffee at once. Her office smelled faintly of polished wood and something else I couldn't place. Maybe her perfume, maybe the weight of confidence she carried like it was second skin. Mid-40s, maybe early 50s, every movement precise and deliberate, but never stiff. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make everyone else pause, without even trying. I noticed how her hand lingered on the edge of her desk, her nails catching the late morning light, just for a second too long. "Measure this," she said, pointing to a shelf that needed reworking. Her voice was calm, controlled, almost dismissive, but underneath, something edged it, sharp and teasing. I bent to get the tape measure, but when I looked up, she was closer than I expected. Too close. Maybe, though she didn't step back when our eyes met. I felt my throat dry, fingers tightening around the metal tape like it was a lifeline. She tilted her head slightly, just enough for me to see the faint curve of her smile. "Prove you're good with wood," she murmured, and for a heartbeat, it wasn't about the carpentry anymore. I couldn't tell if she was teasing, testing, or something else. My hands felt clumsy, and I caught myself adjusting my grip on the tape, though the instructions were simple, logical, something I'd done 100 times before. We worked in silence for a few minutes. The scraping of sandpaper, the faint hum of the drill. It should have been ordinary, background noise. But every sound seemed to draw me closer to her without either of us speaking. I noticed the slight furrow between her brows when she watched me plan the cuts, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, as if leaning in just a fraction closer each time I glanced at her. Then, she came over with a block of wood and, without thinking, pressed it into my chest. Not aggressively, not angrily, just enough to make me notice. Her eyes were steady on mine, unwavering. "Here," she said, almost casually, but I could hear the unspoken challenge underneath the words. And my hands wanted to prove something. Not just that I could handle wood, but that I could meet whatever she was asking without losing myself. For a moment, the world shrank to the two of us in that cramped workshop. Sawdust floating in the air looked like sparks, and I realized I had stopped breathing. When I finally did, it was shallow, hesitant. She straightened, stepping back with the same controlled ease she always carried, but I couldn't shake the way that small, almost intimate gesture had landed in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, compliment the cut, the wood, her presence, but the words tangled in my throat. She didn't need me to speak. The silence said enough. And still, as I returned to my work, my eyes found her again, lingering on the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, the way her hair caught the sunlight. And even now, hours later, I can't stop thinking about that moment. Her hand against me, the weight of her gaze, and the question that lingered longer than any words. Did she know what she was doing to me? I found myself back in the workshop the next afternoon, carrying the unfinished cabinet like it was a secret I wasn't supposed to share. She was already there, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dust on her cheek, leaning over a stack of papers I didn't recognize. Her concentration made her look younger, somehow, vulnerable in a way that felt almost dangerous. "Careful with that," she said without looking up, and I could hear the faint strain in her voice, like she was holding back something, some irritation or exhaustion. I set the piece down, watching her from across the room. She didn't make it easy to read her mood. Always that controlled rhythm, but the tiniest twitch at the corner of her mouth or the quick exhale through her nose told me more than her words ever could. As we worked side by side, sanding and measuring, I noticed how her fingers brushed over the grain, deliberate and precise, yet hesitant. Her laughter came suddenly, a short, surprised sound when I cracked a joke about a crooked corner. It was brief, almost swallowed back, but it lingered with me. She caught herself, looked away, and the moment passed, but I caught the shadow of a smile. I wanted to reach out, brush away the tension I could see tightening her shoulders, but I didn't. I stayed silent, letting my hands move along the wood, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. She glanced at me once, and I thought I saw fatigue flicker across her eyes, as if she carried something heavier than the cabinets we were fixing. Then, she paused, fingers lingering on the edge of the wood, and for the first time, she didn't hide the hesitation. I haven't done this in a while, she admitted, voice soft, almost fragile. Not about the wood, about herself, maybe, but I couldn't be sure. I wanted to say something reassuring, but the words felt too clumsy. Instead, I nodded, letting her feel that I noticed without demanding explanation. The room smelled faintly of sawdust and old varnish, warm light spilling across her hair. She moved a step closer to check a measurement, and I caught the faint brush of her arm against mine. Just a second, just a touch, and yet it sent a jolt I wasn't ready for. Her eyes flicked up, met mine, and she blinked, a little too slowly, as if she had realized something and wanted to hide it again. I wanted to ask if she was tired, if she needed a break, but I held back. There was something in the quiet between us that was more electric than words. A gentle pull I couldn't resist, but couldn't name. She straightened, adjusting the sleeve of her shirt, and smiled briefly, but there was a tension in her jaw that betrayed her guard. As she turned to mark the wood, I stayed just a moment too long, watching the way her hands moved, precise but careful, and I realized I hadn't been breathing again. The sound of the sanding machine faded behind the rush of thoughts I didn't dare speak. And then she looked over her shoulder, just once, and our eyes met. The room seemed smaller, the wood and dust and afternoon sun fading into the space between us. She gave a slight tilt of her head, a gesture that felt intimate and unintentional at the same time, and I realized I was holding on to that moment, already thinking of it before it even ended. The workshop was quieter than usual that evening, the last of the daylight fading into gray clouds pressing against the windows. I was leaning over a corner of the shelf we'd been restoring, and she hovered nearby, sorting small jars of nails and screws. The storm outside made the room feel smaller, closer, like the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. "You shouldn't be staying this late," she said softly, though her eyes didn't leave the jars. There was a weight to her voice, an unspoken awareness that lingered between us. I shrugged, not wanting to answer, not wanting to say the truth, that I was here because I couldn't stop thinking about her, even though I knew I shouldn't. At one point, I reached for a hammer at the same time she did. Our hands brushed, just the slightest touch, and we froze. I felt the heat of her palm against mine, and the air seemed to thicken. She pulled back first, but not completely, leaving a hair's breadth of space that somehow felt like a challenge. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the grain of the wood, listening to the patter of rain against the window, anything to keep from saying what I wanted. There was a soft knock on the door, unexpected, abrupt. My pulse jumped. I glanced at her, and she straightened immediately, mask back in place, professionalism returning like a switch flipped too fast. It was her phone buzzing, and the screen lit up with a name I didn't know. She hesitated, a quick flicker of something vulnerable crossing her expression before she silenced it. "Sorry," she murmured, and for a moment, I thought she might explain, might share the reason her shoulders had stiffened, but she didn't. I respected it, though my chest ached with the tension of the unspoken. I kept sanding, trying to slow my own racing thoughts. Every glance at her was like catching sparks in daylight. There, visible, but impossible to hold. When the storm outside hit harder, a sharp clap of thunder rattling the glass, we both jumped slightly, laughter spilling out almost by accident. It was brief, awkward, and human, but it lingered longer than it should have. We moved closer to calm the trembling jars on the shelf, and I noticed the faint scent of her shampoo, mingled with the dust and varnish. My mind fought itself, telling me to step back, to respect the line we'd never crossed. But the warmth of proximity made my restraint feel fragile. Then, without realizing it, our knees brushed under the workbench. I felt a jolt, a subtle spark that shouldn't have existed, and we both froze again. Her eyes met mine, Not playful this time, not teasing, but something raw, cautious, and almost confessional. My lips parted, a word ready to escape, a feeling ready to spill, but before I could, her phone rang again. She glanced at it, a shadow of annoyance flashing across her face. She stepped back fully, breaking the moment, and the distance between us snapped into place like a shutter closing. I swallowed the words I didn't say, the confession I almost made. I watched her straighten her sleeves, steady her breathing, and leave the workshop, the storm outside masking the quickened beat of my heart. And I stayed there, alone, hands hovering over the wood, thinking about the way her knee had brushed mine, the way her glance had lingered, and the impossibility of forgetting it. It was late again, the workshop emptied of everything except the soft hum of the heater and the faint smell of varnish lingering in the air. I was sitting on a low stool, smoothing the edges of a freshly sanded plank, and she was standing across from me, leaning against the workbench, arms crossed loosely. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, filled with all the words we weren't saying. Finally, she shifted, eyes flicking to mine. "Do you ever think about what this is?" she asked quietly. Her voice trembled just enough to make me pause mid-stroke, heart-catching. I didn't answer right away, because I couldn't. How do you explain that the sound of her breathing made the world shrink? That every glance, every brush of hands, had started to feel like gravity? "I mean us," she continued, fingers brushing the edge of the workbench. "I don't even know why I keep doing this, letting it happen." Her words were careful, hesitant, almost like she was testing the air. I could see her vulnerability in the way her shoulders sagged slightly, in the tremor of her hands. She had built a wall of confidence around herself, and for the first time, I saw a crack. "I don't know," I admitted finally, voice low. Not a confession of feelings, but an acknowledgement of everything we'd been dancing around. My hands shook slightly, not from the sanding, but from the tension coiling tight in my chest. She studied me, lips pressed together, eyes scanning mine like she wanted to measure what I thought, what I felt, but didn't dare say. "It's confusing," she murmured, almost to herself. "Every time you're here, it's like..." Her voice trailed, and the weight of the unfinished sentence hung in the room. We didn't move. We didn't need to. The air between us was thick, electric. I noticed the way her hair fell slightly over her face, the way her fingers tapped against the wood almost absent-mindedly, the small frown between her brows, the brief flicker of worry in her eyes. It was enough for me to understand the turmoil she carried silently. "Why do we keep doing this?" she asked finally, the words sharp in their fragility. She leaned forward just slightly, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest. My throat tightened. I had no answer. There wasn't a logical answer. There was only this. Us, and everything that made no sense. The room felt smaller, smaller than ever before, as though the walls themselves had bent to witness the unspoken truth. I wanted to speak, to bridge the distance between us, but the right words were elusive. I stayed quiet, letting her frustration, confusion, and vulnerability hang in the air. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she straightened, voice quieter now, almost broken. I think I'm afraid of what this could do to me," she said. And she looked away, her eyes glistening, as if admitting it aloud had cost her something she couldn't recover. I watched her, the wood in my hands suddenly feeling heavy and meaningless. I wanted to reach for her, to say something. Anything. But the truth was too sharp, too dangerous. The silence returned, more oppressive now than before, and I realized we had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. And then, in a whisper that barely left her lips, she said, almost to herself, almost to me, "I don't know if I can do this, not with you." I wasn't expecting her to bring it up. We were quiet that morning, the workshop flooded with pale sunlight that caught in the sawdust like tiny motes of gold. I was finishing a joint, carefully smoothing the edge, when she suddenly leaned against the bench, folding her arms loosely. Her eyes were distant, as if she'd stepped somewhere private in her mind. "I haven't told anyone this," she said quietly, voice almost swallowed by the faint hum of the drill in the background. I set the chisel down, not wanting to break the moment, letting her decide whether to continue. She glanced at me briefly, and then away, and I caught the briefest tremor in her hands. Years ago, someone I trusted completely left. Not just me. My whole life felt like it shifted overnight. I didn't expect it. I didn't plan for it. And ever since, I don't let anyone in the same way. The words hung there, fragile but heavy, and for the first time I saw the distance in her confidence. She wasn't flawless, wasn't untouchable. She was just human, carrying scars I hadn't known existed. I wanted to say something, but the right words felt like they had dissolved in the air. Was it someone you loved? I asked gently, more out of habit than intention. I didn't need the answer, really. I just wanted her to know I was listening, that I saw the tremor in her jaw, the quick flicker of pain in her eyes. She swallowed, nodding slowly. Yes, I thought I'd moved on. I thought I'd built walls strong enough that nothing would shake me again. But you make me feel things I didn't think I could feel anymore. It's unsettling. Her fingers grazed the edge of a plank, almost absent-mindedly, tracing a line that seemed like a lifeline. I hesitated, knowing that the moment was delicate, fragile, and entirely hers to reveal. Then my phone buzzed on the bench, but I ignored it. Whatever it was couldn't compare to the weight in the room. Instead, I caught her gaze again, lingering on me in that way that felt like a question with no answer. Then she pulled something from the drawer, a small, yellowed photograph, edges curled, almost hidden. She held it out without words. I looked down and saw her younger self, smiling with someone I didn't know. The sunlight caught the glass frame, casting a soft reflection on the workbench. She looked at me then, her expression uncertain, raw. I kept it because I couldn't let go, even when I tried. I didn't know what to say. There was a quiet gravity in her confession that went beyond sympathy or empathy. It was intimate, almost sacred. I reached out, lightly touching the corner of the frame, not to pry, but to offer some quiet acknowledgement. Her fingers twitched toward mine, almost, and then withdrew. For a long moment, we didn't speak. I could feel her breath, the subtle tremor of her hand, the way her chest rose and fell against the faint rhythm of the room. It wasn't dramatic, not loud, not cinematic. It was honest. And that honesty felt seismic. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, I didn't think anyone would ever see this side of me. Not like this. And I realized, in that small, sunlit workshop, that everything we hadn't said, every careful glance and restrained word, had been building toward this fragile, irreversible moment. The workshop smelled of wood and varnish, familiar and grounding, but it felt different now, like the air itself had shifted, heavier, charged in a way neither of us tried to name. I was crouched by the shelf, checking a corner joint, when I felt her presence behind me. She didn't say anything, just leaned over slightly to inspect my work, and I realized my chest had tightened, anticipation threading through every nerve. Looks sturdy, she murmured, brushing her fingers along the edge I had sanded. Not a compliment exactly, but not dismissive either. There was something tender in the way she traced the line, almost reverent, as if she was letting me show her who I was in a way that words never could. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Her quiet observation, the soft tilt of her head, the slow, measured way she moved closer, everything said more than I ever could. Then she straightened, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I think I'm ready to stop pretending, she said, voice low, cautious, like testing the ground before stepping fully. Not with a declaration, not with flourish, just a simple truth that hung between us like a fragile bridge. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of her words settle. I didn't reach for her, not yet. Not because I wasn't drawn to her, but because this shared acknowledgement, was the only step that mattered. I could feel the space around us shrink, the air warm with quiet understanding, the tension between longing and restraint melting into something steadier, earned. We worked side by side, hands occasionally brushing as we passed tools, each touch minimal but electrifying in its subtlety. I noticed the curve of her neck, the soft rhythm of her breathing, and the faint smudge of sawdust on her sleeve. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just the reality of two people learning how close they could be without rushing, without pretending. Finally, she sat down on the low stool next to me, letting out a quiet sigh. I followed, close enough to feel the heat from her shoulder, yet careful to give space. We didn't speak, and we didn't need to. The quiet between us was full, heavy with everything unspoken and understood. I reached out almost unconsciously, brushing a stray hair from her face. Her eyes flicked up to mine, and for a moment, the workshop, the wood, the afternoon sunlight, they all disappeared. Her hand hovered near mine, and then she let it rest lightly on my wrist. Just a touch, small, deliberate, human. Enough. We stayed like that, in shared space, in stillness, letting the understanding settle without forcing it into words. It was quiet. It was honest. And somehow, it felt like the only way it could have happened. Earned, fragile, and entirely ours. When she finally stood, she didn't rush away. She just looked at me, a soft, unspoken question in her gaze, and I gave the faintest nod. Acknowledgement, agreement, something that said we'd both chosen this moment without needing to define it out loud. And as she turned back to the workbench, letting the afternoon sun streak across the wood and the dust, I realized that whatever came next, whatever distance or hesitation remained, had already been bridged. We were here, together, quietly, completely. Looking back now, weeks later, I realize how quietly everything shifted that afternoon in the workshop. It wasn't a grand confession, a declaration shouted over the clamor of life. It was small, deliberate, human. A shared silence, a touch of hands, the understanding that some things didn't need words to be real. I see her differently now, not just as the woman who had hired me, tested me, challenged me, but as someone who had let me in, carefully, hesitantly, and with all the layers of her past still intact. There's a vulnerability in her that I'll never forget, a trust that was earned rather than given. And I feel the change in myself too. I'm less impatient, more attentive, and somehow braver in moments I never thought I could be. We still work together, still measure, sand, and fit wood side by side, but everything carries a new weight, a quiet warmth. A glance can say more than a paragraph, a brush of fingers more than a conversation. Love, I've realized, doesn't always arrive in fireworks. Sometimes it grows in small, deliberate acts, moments of attention, patience, and respect. There are days I catch her watching me, almost absent-mindedly, and I feel the echo of that first spark, that nervous electricity in the workshop. And there are times when I just notice the way she sighs in relief when a project is done, the faint curl of her smile, and I remember how fragile and powerful all this has been. I don't know what the future holds, not in some dramatic sense, but in the quiet, honest reality of shared mornings and lingering afternoons. I do know that whatever it brings, we've learned to move carefully, to let connection happen naturally, to honor the small moments that actually matter. And for once, that feels enough. Sometimes I still think about the first day, the way she pressed the wood against me, the challenge in her voice, the glance that made me catch my breath. And I realized that was never really about the wood. It was about noticing each other, about learning how to exist in the same space without rushing or forcing anything. It's strange, but comforting, to think that this is what love can be. Not perfect, not fast, not easy, but alive, tangible, and human. And maybe that's what makes it worth everything we've been through to reach it. So now, when I watch her from across the workshop, or when our hands brush over a plank by accident, there's a quiet acknowledgement of everything that's come before, everything that's been earned, and everything still possible. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?